In an age ruled by steel, blood, and fear, men didn't just fight for power, they forged it. The Middle Ages wasn't just a time of kings and castles, it was a living laboratory of war, where a handful of warriors shaped the way entire nations fought, ruled, and survived. These weren't mythical heroes or fantasy knights, they were real, their blades were real, their genius terrifyingly real. Tonight, you'll meet the 10 deadliest medieval warriors in history, men who turned battlefields into legends, and whose tactics still echo in the DNA of modern warfare. From marshland rebels to kings of conquest, each one changed how war was fought and how empires were built. Stay until the end, because the #1 warrior didn't just win battles, he redefined what it meant to be a knight. The story begins not in a palace, but in the swamps of England, where one man used mud, reeds, and smoke to defy an empire. His name was Hereward the Wake, and he turned resistance into an art form. After William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, most Anglo-Saxons bowed, but Hereward didn't. He knew the eastern fens, a labyrinth of water, bogs, and hidden causeways better than any Norman knight ever could. His weapon wasn't a sword. It was the land itself. When Norman troops tried to cross, he lit the reed beds around them on fire. The thick smoke blinded the soldiers. The heat drove horses mad, and those who fled found themselves sucked into the mud, drowning under their own armor. The mighty invaders, who had crushed every army before, were humiliated by a man they couldn't even reach. William himself ordered floating siege towers built from ships, timber causeways, and even bog roads just to get to him. The cost of taking one rebel's fortress was enormous, and that alone proved how dangerous Hereward really was. He wasn't just a local hero, he was the nightmare that taught conquerors the limits of power. The Fenlands became a symbol of defiance, and Hereward's legend, though blurred by myth, stood for something that frightened kings, the idea that even the smallest man, armed with knowledge and nerve, could make an empire bleed. But if Hereward fought with shadows and smoke, the next warrior ruled with speed and iron, and his fight would change the fate of all England. Harold Godwinson was the last Anglo-Saxon king, and possibly one of the most overworked men in military history. In 1066, he fought 2 invasions in less than 3 weeks. When the Viking warlord Harald Hardrada landed in the north, Godwinson didn't hesitate. He marched his entire army almost 300 kilometers in 5 days, an unimaginable pace for medieval soldiers, burdened with armor and gear. And then, at Stamford Bridge, he launched a surprise attack that annihilated the Vikings. But before his men could even rest, word came: William of Normandy had landed in the south. So Harold turned around, marching his exhausted army back another 300 kilometers. No reinforcements. No rest, no choice. At Hastings, he formed his famous shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, an unbreakable wall of axes and iron. For hours, it held. Norman cavalry charged and broke like waves against a cliff. Harold's men were winning until William unleashed a new trick. His troops pretended to retreat. The English, thinking victory was theirs, chased them downhill and were slaughtered when the Normans turned back. Harold fought to the end, arrow through the eye, sword in hand. What made him great wasn't just bravery, it was endurance. He nearly stopped both Viking and Norman conquests in 1 month. 2 battles, 2 empires, 1 king. And yet, when Harold fell, his death opened the door for one of the most ruthless conquerors the world would ever see. Before William became the Conqueror, he was simply Duke of Normandy, but his military mind was generations ahead of his time. His genius lay in combined arms, archers, infantry, and cavalry, working in perfect coordination, something almost no medieval army could manage. At Hastings, William organized his forces in 3 waves: bowmen to break the enemy line, infantry to press the attack, and armored knights to deliver the killing blow. He was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. But his brilliance didn't stop at the battlefield. After landing in England, he dismantled his own ships and used the wood to build siege towers, fortifications, and roads. Nothing was wasted. Every plank became part of his new empire. He even created mobile fortresses from the hulls of his boats, medieval logistics at its peak. William's invasion wasn't just about swords. It was about supply lines, planning, and psychological warfare. He turned conquest into an equation, one solved with precision, patience, and a terrifying will to win. And that mindset would echo through his descendants, from warriors who led crusades to kings who built empires. One of those descendants would become Richard the Lionheart, perhaps the most famous knight of all time, and for good reason. During the Third Crusade, he marched his army through scorching desert along the coast of the Holy Land. Saladin's forces harassed him constantly, hit, run, vanish. Most commanders would have cracked, but Richard was cold steel wrapped in discipline. He kept his army in perfect marching formation for 17 kilometers under fire, heavy knights in the center, infantry on the flanks, crossbowmen at the rear. Every movement was timed. When his men began to lose patience, he ordered silence. When Saladin's cavalry overextended, he gave a single signal and unleashed a perfectly synchronized countercharge. The result? A slaughter. At Arsuf, Richard's 200-man household knights punched through thousands of enemy horsemen like a spear through silk. That battle wasn't just won by strength, it was won by control. Richard turned chaos into clockwork. They called him Lionheart not because he roared, but because he never flinched. But if Richard was the embodiment of royal precision, another English commander would perfect that art of patience and use it to defy impossible odds. Henry V at Agincourt faced a nightmare. His army was sick, starving, and outnumbered 5-1. The French army gleamed in armor. The English were covered in mud. But Henry didn't panic. He turned terrain into a weapon. He ordered his men to plant sharpened wooden stakes into the ground at an angle, a deadly forest, waiting for any cavalry charge. Then he waited for the rain. The battlefield became a swamp. The French knights, trapped in mud, sank under their own weight. Each step added pounds of sludge to their armor until they could barely move. The English longbowmen rained death from behind the stakes, their arrows tearing through plate like thunder. When captured, French knights threatened to disrupt the lines. Henry made a brutal decision. He had them executed on the spot. It was cold. It was efficient. It was war stripped of romance. At Agincourt, Henry didn't just win a battle. He shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. But before Henry ever rose to power, another warrior had already proven how brains could beat brute force. Meet Sir John Chandos, the man behind some of England's greatest victories in the 100 Years' War. He wasn't the loudest knight on the field, he was the one quietly rearranging it. At Poitiers in 1356, he faced an army twice the size of his own. Instead of meeting them head-on, he lured the French knights into a narrow path flanked by hedges. Hidden English longbowmen opened fire at point-blank range. Horses screamed. Armor jammed. The path became a death trap. Then, when the enemy faltered, Chandos led a counterattack dismounted, deliberate, deadly. The French king himself was captured. Europe was stunned. Chandos didn't win through luck or glory. He won because he understood terrain, timing, and human weakness. When he died years later in a minor skirmish, English soldiers said half their fortune died with him. He was proof that intellect was the sharpest sword of all. And intellect was exactly what his contemporary, Sir John Hawkwood, took to the next level. Hawkwood wasn't a noble knight, he was a mercenary, and Italy was his playground. After cutting his teeth in the 100 Years' War, he took his band of killers, the White Company, to the highest bidder. Florence, Milan, Pisa, they all wanted him. Hawkwood's true genius was his invention of the moving fortress. Picture a box of soldiers, archers, and crossbowmen on the outside, cavalry and supplies at the center. It moved like a tank before tanks existed, slow, protected, unstoppable. When cities couldn't afford long sieges, they hired Hawkwood. His raids were fast, precise, and horrifying. He didn't waste men or time. He destroyed crops, burned supply lines, and forced surrender through starvation. War as economics. Yet even his enemies admired him. Hawkwood was disciplined, calculating, and never fought without an advantage. He once said, "The man who avoids battle wins twice, first in patience, then in survival." Florence buried him as a hero. His tactics would later inspire Renaissance generals, proof that sometimes genius wears mercenary armor. And if Hawkwood represented ruthless professionalism, another English warrior would embody loyalty, innovation, and iron discipline not on foreign soil, but at home. Edward I, the tall, relentless Longshanks, wasn't just a conqueror, he was a military architect. When he invaded Wales, he didn't simply build castles. He built a network, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, each positioned like chess pieces, supporting one another through roads and supply lines. It was the first real logistical grid of medieval warfare. Edward also revolutionized his army structure. He ordered that every estate supply knights and 5 hobilars light cavalry perfect for scouting and ambush. This mix of speed and strength gave England a flexible fighting force decades ahead of its rivals. He understood what most kings didn't. Castles didn't conquer, roads did. Edward's empire was built not just with steel, but with planning the kind of military foresight that would echo through every English campaign for the next 200 years. But his own son would take those lessons and turn them into pure, devastating artistry. Edward the Black Prince, son of Edward III, was the first celebrity general of his age. At just 16, he led troops at Crecy and annihilated one of Europe's finest armies. His weapon? The English longbow, a 6-foot killing machine that could pierce armor at 100 meters. Before battle, he drilled his archers to fire in rhythm, creating what chroniclers called the Drum of Death. Thousands of arrows filled the sky, a storm of steel that shattered entire cavalry charges before they even reached the English lines. At Crecy, French knights charged again and again, only to be slaughtered in the mud. Edward's positioning high ground, staggered archers, controlled retreat lines turned chaos into choreography. He didn't just win, he changed the hierarchy of war. The longbow made commoners more dangerous than nobles. It was the beginning of the end for the armored elite. And while his victories shaped the battlefield, one last night would shape the very soul of knighthood itself. At the top stands William Marshal, the man history calls the greatest knight who ever lived. He was undefeated in 55 tournaments, not the polite jousts of later centuries, but brutal, full-contact battles where bones broke and swords splintered. He captured hundreds of opponents for ransom, built his fortune, and rose from a minor noble's son to the right hand of kings. At 70 years old, when France invaded and England was collapsing, Marshal took command. He led a cavalry wedge through enemy lines at Lincoln, coordinating rooftop crossbow fire as he cut straight into the French formation. It was genius born from a lifetime of war. After victory, he didn't chase glory. He stabilized the realm, reissued the Magna Carta, and restored faith in the crown. Even his enemies admired him. When he finally lay dying, he took vows as a Templar knight, placing his sword across his chest, a symbol of the world he'd built and defended. William Marshal wasn't just a warrior. He was the bridge between brutality and honor, between the chaos of conquest and the birth of law. 10 men, 10 lives, 10 revolutions in the way humanity fought. From Hereward swamps to Marshal's code of chivalry, their stories trace a single idea that war isn't just destruction, it's invention. It's adaptation. It's survival. So the next time you picture the Middle Ages as dark or primitive, remember, these warriors weren't relics. They were innovators, engineers of chaos, masters of order. Their swords rusted long ago. But their ideas? They're still with us. If you enjoyed this journey through the greatest warriors of the medieval world, hit like, subscribe, and tell us which of these 10 would you follow into battle. Because next time, we're diving into the weapons that made these legends unstoppable.
The cost is often highest to those who seek peace, Marshal.